This is Elena Wagner on April 4th around 6 p.m. with Alex Poska. So Alex, when and where were you born?
I was born July 14th, 1989 in Mission Viejo, California at St. Joseph's Catholic Hospital.
Very cool. And where were your parents born?
Both my parents are from the Midwest. My dad was born in Chicago, and my mom was born somewhere just outside of Chicago. She lived in the suburbs of Chicago.
And when did they come to California?
They met in Illinois, lived in New York, and then eventually made it to California sometime in the late 80s, or maybe early 80s, I don't know, sometime, maybe about 5 or 6 years, I think, before I was born, which was 1989. So sometime around then, I'm not exactly sure. But then they ended up divorcing, but they both still live in California in, 1998.
Would you say that your family was political when you were growing up?
My dad wasn't very political. My grandma wasn't really political, but she was a disciplinarian. But that didn't really come out in any kind of political context. But on my mom's side, my grandpa and grandma were very conservative. And actually recently, my grandma on my dad's side described, she said that she thought one reason that they were conservatives is because they moved to the suburbs. Back in the early 1950s, that's when they moved in the suburbs of Illinois, of Chicago. So they became conservative when they moved into the suburbs to fit in. It's the theory of my grandma who lived in urban Chicago at that time.
And what's a disciplinarian?
She's just very into discipline, you know. You go to school, you get good grades, you have good manners, you treat people well, you worry about money, and you make money and live a good life. You know, just very
Interesting.
Not American dream, but just very work based. American dream. I don't know.
Interesting. So you mentioned your grandparents and your father. What about your mother?
She's conservative, her parents were. So she actually, I think she's helping organize for the Republican primary that's going to happen soon in California. But yeah, she thinks she's in the Tea Party and stuff.
So, do you remember your own initiation into political involvement and what made that happen?
Well, I was pretty conservative because I think of my mom growing up because she used to listen to a lot of conservative talk radio. Then in high school, started learning a little more. We had a class called Humanities senior year where we did an election simulation, and we were reading up on the candidates because we were trying to figure out what candidate we were going to work on a campaign for. And one kid brought up Ron Paul and convinced the teacher to have Ron Paul be in the election. I was like, whoa, what the heck? I had thought of that idea too, but I thought we couldn't make up bring in other candidates. We just had to choose one. And so that I became more interested in because I just found out and became interested in libertarianism. And around the same time, I had met people from Santa Barbara and from San Diego through playing music, and we played a couple shows together. And I had met them and a bunch of their friends up in Santa Barbara, and they were all anarchists. And so I got introduced to anarchism. At the same time, I was learning about libertarianism on my own.
Wow!
And they have a lot of things that overlap. About personal liberty and freedom, and that's when I started learning more about anarchism, and me and one of my friends had started reading books about it, and he had started getting into drugs and weird stuff, and had a brother who was into just nihilistic kind of things, and he was a weird dude, but he had started taking some of the things from anarchists kind of social circles Crime Think and other kind of anarchist press groups are run by young kids, kind of AK Press here in the Bay. There's other groups Microcosm Press. There's other they release zines and pamphlets and books and stuff that are pretty DIY, but a lot of them espouse anarchism. And Crime Think has a very specific vision of anarchism, which is kind of gutter punk. It's kind of gutter punky. It's I'll live, kind of in poverty, but living off the excesses of capitalism, and do what you want to do, and you don't have to work, and it's kind of not very sustainable. idea of anarchism. But my friend was kind of like into that stuff, so he had started like stealing books and like stuff, and like we had like we went on tour and as a band our high school and our senior year of high school, and we've been reading about this stuff, and like we kind of like had been getting very much into economics of it. We were like, oh well, like fuck like these corporations and stuff, like let's just like like we don't have any money, like we're trying to like go up to San Francisco and back, and like we're not like making any money playing these shows, we're just like trying to like play music and like do our thing and have fun. Like who cares if we're like stealing from like a chain grocery store, or like who cares if we're stealing from a gas station. So like we kind of like gotten into like anarchism, and like we kind of used that to justify like stealing stuff on tour, and we met more people through these music scenes who were like into anarchism, and I had started learning more about like the political side of it. And had eventually like acquired some books and like started reading a bit. And then when I got to college, I had done more of like reading about it on my own, and like consciously like objected out of the 2008 election because of it, and was just like screw like voting, and like I was so like fed up with all like the politics and like how stupid the right had become, and how it got hijacked by like just like ridiculous neocons, and how like liberals were just like pushing like these totally like stupid policies and like trying to speak for ridiculous like disenfranchised people in the most just like obscenely capitalist ways that just viewed them as like pawns in a big game, and that was just ridiculous. That's not politics, And so I was drifting more and more towards anarchism, and I started meeting people at Berkeley who were into it. I actually met a guy named Brian Tanzi, who actually, who was into it at the time, and we had started having some very intellectual conversations my freshman year about that kind of stuff, and he challenged me in a lot of my beliefs, and I like started thinking harder about it and like really like getting into it. And then there were some protests that started my sophomore year, and a lot of people involved in these protests, which were about education, were anarchists as well. And so I met like these people, and
what made
that's
you...
when I really finally felt like I could like really call myself an anarchist, and would back it up and talk about like how I believe that there is like a cultural shift that like could be enabled in people to like live out in a fantasy of like well, it wouldn't be a fantasy anymore. It'd be a real almost utopia of people like cooperating and not having government, not having to have solidified laws, but having code, like having social norms and social codes that people could live by, and sort out in smaller localized groups, to live sustainably together.
And what made you want to get involved in those protests that sophomore year? What year was that? That was 2010?
No, it was 2009. It was fall of 2009. At first, like there was a big occupation on campus of Wheeler Hall, and I just like didn't really. I was surprised that people were doing direct action. Like I had talked to a lot of people like my freshman year about like the tree sitters, and then about like the protests that were coming up at the beginning of sophomore year. And I was just like, it's ridiculous. I don't care about people standing around like yelling. I don't care about people just like sitting up in trees for days on end. Like that's not really that great of like direct action to me. And like I was like I would be all up in this if like people were actually down to do like real direct action and like implement like real tactics to force demands to be met. And when I saw these people doing that, at the Wheeler Hall occupation in 2009, it made me realize that there's people out there I needed to meet and needed to become friends with, because I obviously shared something in common with them.
Yeah.
And so I seeked them out, and I don't know, by happenstance, I found out about meetings that maybe I shouldn't have known about, and
how did you find out about them?
Met people that just people offhandedly mentioning them, in public forums, but like not assuming that many people would pick up on it, and I did, and meeting people that I have very strong affinities with, and I've sat next to in jail with,
Well, I'm excited to hear those stories later. So, Occupy Wall Street started last September in New York City, and was that the first time that you became aware of it?
Yeah, I became aware that there was an Occupy Wall Street in September after the people entered Zuccotti Park, and when I found out that a friend of mine who used to live in the Bay had gone to New York and was participating. But when I first saw it, it was really weird, because it was reminiscent of like stuff that had been happening on campus and planning that me and other people had found out about, that had involved similar tactics of occupations. and that were happening during protests at UC Berkeley, UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis, people occupying libraries for longer hours, and it all seemed to be very reminiscent of what we had been doing in our education struggles, and it clicked with me right away that it was something similar, but something that was going to be pretty important.
Yeah, it seems like Occupy has become a really important buzzword in the world vocabulary. What is Occupy? Could you define it for us?
See, that's the weird part, is Occupy became a huge buzzword, and I was just, floored, because I remember winter 2009, 2010, right around January and December, me and my brother and some friends went on tour. It was right after the occupations had happened at Berkeley, and I had been getting involved with protests there, and people were going around saying "Occupy everything." So when we were on tour, we were going around just shouting this at random shows and playing it and talking about it, and it became a huge Occupy slogan as well. And I think it came from that partially. I guess I read the whole Adbusters thing. They had been following our protests and what had been going on at other universities. Not just UC Berkeley, but also UC Santa Cruz, UC Davis. There's some other places on the East Coast that had some occupations, and Occupy was basically a retaking of space that belonged to retaking of space that we felt belonged to us as students. There were buildings on campus that weren't open for our use, but yet we were paying for them. We were paying for the maintenance of them. We were paying for the people who were saying what goes on in those buildings, and we were paying for the classes that we were taking in those buildings. And when we don't have places to study, late at night that aren't, filled with distractions, such as, apartments and cafes, or when it's 3 a.m, we need a place to study because we can't be at home, we need to have space. So we had started taking spaces and creating open occupations. And it was a reclamation of space that, rightfully belonged to people. The people, and in this case it was us, the students at the UC, who was taking back space that we could use, and we set up things like the Open University, where we kept Wheeler Hall open for 7 days straight, and there were teach-ins, there were poetry readings, there were performances, and there were also just random rooms open to study at 3 a.m. I remember studying with people from a co-op, Lothlorien, and every hour on the hour we would have a dance party for 3 minutes and then go back and keep studying. We did this till 4 a.m. Things that I would have never done, and I would have not passed some classes had I not been in that building, that day. And I actually would not have passed some classes if I had not been up that late studying and had the opportunity to be on campus studying that late, because I was in another building when everyone got arrested during the open university.
Oh, wow.
I was sleeping in another building that I had proper access to at the time, because having a place to be in after hours on campus when is a good thing, and students need that.
Yeah.
And you're not able to get that unless you have certain privileges. And
so
that shouldn't be the case.
So how do you think that translates, or that has been taken up by the Occupy movement?
See, that was one of the things that didn't really confound me, but one of the things that was it was an interesting disjoint, is people were going in and taking public parks and taking ostensibly public space, and that's true, and that does play into one huge aspect where you do have giant land management companies. You have a ton of public space that's being bought by people with huge amounts of money that normal citizens can't afford and can't even get it in on an acre of it. You have to form huge grant organizations in places like Orange County to buy natural land, to buy natural habitat back, so these giant land companies don't build more suburbs over it.
Yeah.
And I can see Occupy relating to that, explicitly with the occupation of public parks and public spaces. But otherwise, it seemed more something like occupying consciousness, which a lot of people have brought up, that I thought was same kind of thing we were trying to get out there with our Occupy everything. It was kind of a demand everything, take everything. We need to take back this space. We need to take back everything for the people, and not let these other people control us, and not let this small minority dictate what the field of possibilities the majority has to live in.
Yeah, that's an interesting thread right there. I think the 1% and the 99% have become really common phrases in the national vocabulary. What do you think of the idea of the 99% and the 1%?
I mean, metaphorically, it makes sense. Putting such strong, like, numbers on it, I think was a bit of, like, it was kind of necessary for it to be a slogan, but it's maybe not exactly representative of, like, the kinds of challenges and coalitions we have to build to break down the barriers, It breaks down as a good binary of economic control, which is, a big factor. People are very concerned about economics, in Occupy, and, economic equality and economic justice. But it's, I don't know, there's going to be people in the 1% who are friendly to us and want to help us, hopefully. There's people on the left, which people don't realize, this is a very leftist movement, and it's anti-capitalist in a way. And there's wealthy people who can be anti-capitalist, but just use the system to make a ton of money. I mean, you can have anti-capitalist views and engage in capitalism. Almost every anarchist has to, despite the fact they don't agree with it. And there's always been rich people who are vaguely left, who are willing to sympathize with the more radical aspects and the more where, according to social norms, more radical views and given them money and help them along. There's always rich lefties who have thrown money at the more radical lefties. That's just what's happened historically, and that's what's happened with Occupy, too. Like, it's a valid criticism that Fox News and all that make, but at the same time, those lefties are speaking more for a bigger majority than, Fox News and conservatives think they are.
So what do you think would be a more representative, if less slogan appropriate way to describe the Occupy movement?
I have no idea. I'm not someone who keeps up on statistics. Like, I don't know, like, all the statistics. And, like, when I end up reading, like, articles, like, when I see all these statistics, I never end up memorizing them or remembering them. I just remember, like, oh, it's a big number or something. It's kind of just, it's more like, what people are asking for is a renegotiation of the power relations in this country. And what people are saying is that they don't want power concentrated in, the economic pirates, basically, of America. The people who have gone in and just, extracted so much, excess value out of, the poorest classes in America and then sold them back the products and made even more money. It's almost ridiculous, that you have, like, bankers and you have investment, people dealing with investments that can make millions and millions of dollars and not have to pay taxes on it because it's still technically invested somewhere, even though they could pull it out the day after, and not have to pay as much taxes. It's ridiculous. And then they get, tax breaks for all these big corporations, and there's just a complete inequality in who has the power to say what goes on with our government and with economics in America. And people want to have a say in their government, and they want to renegotiate the power relations of how the government functions.
You're kind of onto this, and I'd like to hear more of what you think the demands of Occupy are, because there's been a lot of talk about how Occupy has no concrete demands.
Yeah, I mean, personally, what I think some of the demands should be, I think the people need to look very local when they're making demands, and that people should have coordinated, local demands that would influence, not only cultural shift, but, policy change and, a change in the habit of people, even if that has to be somewhat by force, or at least provide options for people to change their habits and engage in more equitable living, engage in more equitable economics, and engage in more fair, business practices and corporate practices. I think people can do a lot at the local level with Occupy, and I don't think that's been really reached out. I think people just are trying to, grandstand. There's a lot of grandstanding going on, and the grandstanding, when you do that, you have to have demands, because why are you up in everyone's face if you don't really have anything to say? Is the narrative in the mainstream media. If you're going to be making noise, you got to have something to say. It has to be purpose. You have to be able to fit into a media narrative. And and having a multitude of demands doesn't fit into their narrative. And so it's hard to have a cohesive vision and for people to understand that, like, you can have difference in unity, within a movement.
So to bring it to the local level, the first large Occupy Oakland event was the March on the Port of Oakland last November. Were you involved in that at all?
Well, it's interesting you say that because I don't really see that as like the first big action, but like that was the first like big, I guess, like the first big action that got like nationwide attention. I actually didn't go to that because I had limiting circumstances with ongoing court cases that I just didn't want to take a chance with getting arrested again.
Yeah.
But like the first time I was involved with Occupy Oakland was the move-in day, and I was coordinating with Food Not Bombs people so we could feed all the people who were going to stay overnight. And what I remember was the move-in day. It was been kind of soggy and it was kind of dreary, but everyone went to Franco Gala Plaza, renamed it. There was a giant General Assembly just with like thousands of people at the General Assembly, while other people were playing in drum circles. Hundreds of people were setting up tents. There were multiple medical tents going up. There were people who were already on the internet. We had put up a tent for Food Not Bombs, and hundreds of people already been served food and dinner. I had dinner that night, and then I had to go back and to schoolwork, so I left early. And I didn't end up sleeping over any nights because I had, I had a previous court case that had been resolved and I didn't want to get arrested again.
What was that court case from?
That was it wasn't an occupation, but it was a sit-in on the roof of Wheeler Hall, where we had a bunch of people chained together, and we were protesting Operational Excellence, which was an initiative they started at Berkeley, as well as, just the fee hikes and the administrative abuse and administrative pay raises.
What do you remember feeling on that first day that you went to the plaza?
To occupy, oh man, it was pretty wild. Like, we were really stressed out. Like, we had showed up at someone's house where we had been gathering the food, and they had already been cooking the food. We were all just kind of like waiting. We were just like, we had no idea what was going on. We had no idea how many people were already there, and I was the driver. I brought my car down, because I was, and so, like, we were just, like, hanging out. We were just kind of, like, munching on some food, and we just started moving everything into cars, and then we all just drove down. We had to, like, find, like, the quickest way to, like, get right up next to the plaza, and then we just, like, unload everything as fast as possible, and just, like, set everything up, and we're just getting prepared to just, like, serve massive amounts of food. It was just really exciting because so many people were, like, really excited that Food Not Bombs was showing up to feed everyone, because Food Not Bombs shows up to a lot of protests and feeds tons of people in the Bay Area every day. I mean, I live, like, less than a block away from People's Park, and they serve almost every day of the week. For one of the, I think it's East Bay Food Not Bombs. They serve there, and then there's also Food Not Bombs in Oakland that serve at other locations.
Were the police a strong presence at the plaza on that first day?
No, there wasn't. It was definitely not as strong. They kind of didn't really have, like, as much of an idea. They didn't really have much of a plan. Like, I mean, we were able to drive right up to the plaza, we were surprised because we were like, oh crap, like, what's going to happen if, like, there's police cars? And we had, like, contingency plans to just, like, literally have, like, 10 people waiting to pull everything out of the car so we didn't have to stop, so we could keep driving while people were unloading, because we didn't want to have to stop or risk a ticket or get arrested. We had planned to, like, have to avoid, like, the cops.
Yeah.
And we didn't face any problems at all, which was surprising. And I don't really know what happened after that. I mean, it might have escalated pretty quickly, but it was just a lot of excitement. People had already taken over, like, the whatever that is, Broadway, and I don't know, it's like 12th Street or 13th Street or something. And people already, and there were some cops there, like, but they weren't, like, there weren't lines of riot cops, there weren't riot cops or anything. There were people, there were children, there. It was so many different people. I mean, there were all sorts of people. I saw so many random friends of mine, so many people I had been in protests with, people I had been arrested with, like, and didn't know, but had been arrested with them before. I mean, it was quite a scene. I mean, Oakland's pretty left, and I don't think people realized this much till everyone showed up that day, how left Oakland is. Oakland's pretty left.
So as the encampment grew, did you spend a lot of time there, or were you
That's
involved?
the thing, is I didn't really end up going back a lot. I mean, I stayed away just because of, like, all the worrying, and also, oh man, that was in the fall. It wasn't a good time for me. I went through a breakup with a girlfriend that I was still living with, and that was...
Oh, that must have been hard.
Yeah, that was annoying. So,
It's hard.
me and my brother had other stuff to deal with, and it's like, I'm gonna go down to Oakland down there every day. It was pretty rainy. They got a lot of the rain out of the way in the fall this year in the Bay. There hasn't been as much this spring, which is kind of nice, but
Yeah.
it's too bad it all happened. I mean, I remember there were some days where I'd see pictures or videos from Oakland, and it'd just be like, you know, the tree would be flooded with water because there's just so much rain that would come down.
The tree, the plaza.
The oak, the oak tree in Franco Gao Plaza, it's like the original oak tree planted when Oakland was like whatever first incorporated or something. But like it will fill up like a pond, and then there was just like mud everywhere. Like it just gets nasty in the plaza when it rains. It's probably why they were able to lobby health and safety complaints.
What about Occupy Cal that started later on in the fall? Were you involved in that at all?
Yes, that was kind of cool. We were, there was a very core group of people who were organizing these protests for education, where we've been shouting "Occupy everything" and stuff like that, and had been involved in multiple occupations and know some police officers because of that, and we had mostly just gotten over the empathy, the just complete lack of caring on campus. All the apathy was just, it was disgusting. It got to the point where we've got 1,000 people that showed up when we were sitting on the ledge, but there was no follow-up and uptake from it when we tried, and people were just, just like, screw it. And then Occupy Cal happened, and people were very much excited by the word Occupy, and we were just like, really? We've been shouting Occupy in your faces for, the last, 2 years, and now that, it's a national thing, everyone's like, okay, Occupy Cal, let's do this. And so, it was cool, and we used, the momentum of previous years still to bring Occupy Cal around. We used the traditional days of protest. We cited some previous stuff, and people had been getting off of student conduct and things like that. Our protest sitting on the roof got a number of people from the first ever Wheeler occupation got their charges dropped, from student conduct and stuff like that. So there had been some gains that had been won in the spring. And I guess Occupy was needed to get people to come back out. And so, hundreds of people started coming out again. It was interesting because with the original protests, the first Wheeler Hall was very important, but so was the big protest on September, the walkout, September 23rd, I think, walkout or something like that. And it kind of happened in reverse in Occupy Cal. They had their big event, with Robert Reich, and that brought 3,000 people or something. And it was more appropriate that happened then, there was a big buildup of people that had happened until then.
And what
but after Robert Reich, it died out a bit again.
What exactly happened that night that Robert Reich showed up?
I wasn't there the whole time. I showed up and got a good surveil of the scene from the top of the whatever Golden Bear Cafe, just because I was like, oh, other people are up there. I want to see what it looks like. It's pretty cool from up there.
How do you get up there?
Pretty sweet. I just scale the wall. I'm pretty good at climbing, so I can climb a lot of stuff. But it was cool, and I didn't catch his speech, but I wasn't really interested in hearing him speak. I don't know. I think that people are very invested in huge speakers and big faces, particularly white male ones. In Berkeley protests, going back to Mario Savio, people always just try to have a Savio-like figure, and a lot of times it's a white male that emerges doing it. Even probably back when, I don't know the details of the South African apartheid protests here, but I'm sure there was some white guy grandstanding, and it's just kind of who cares? We don't need big names. You don't need someone that has some sort of power or token about them for doing something great to become a leader. We were very invested in keeping it pretty leaderless in the former protests that have been going on for education. And in Occupy Cal, they tried to keep that. And it happened to some degree, but fortunately, with dwindling interest, there became a core group of people that became basically the leadership, and they're a lot of what only exists now, I think, of Occupy Cal.
Yeah. Well, what did you think of Occupy Oakland showing up that night? The march from Oakland?
People were really jazzed about that, It's tough because UCPD are just a wild dog that's just on a very loose leash. And I think it's hard for Occupy Oakland people to show up in the first place because, they have nice curfew laws on campus that they can enforce. and they did for some people, and I think it made it hard. There was a lot of Occupy Cal people who went down to Oakland, but they didn't really weren't like, oh hey, we're Occupy Cal here and Occupy Oakland. They were like, no, we're Occupy Oakland as well. I think people had a double consciousness about it in some ways, which I think was cool, and I wish it happened more. Because I knew a lot of people who had been involved in protesting on campus here at Cal, and had been involved in protesting education all over the Bay, who were like, nah, I'm just Occupy Oakland, I'm going to let the people on campus deal with the campus stuff. Even if they were still members of the campus, which was kind of odd to me.
What do you mean by double consciousness?
That people could sympathize with, and say, I'm part of Occupy Cal, but I'm also part of Occupy Oakland. And instead of saying, oh, we're Occupy Oakland, and now we're here at Occupy Cal, but I'm still an Occupy Oakland person, The solidarity, it's kind of like W.E.B. Du Bois, double consciousness,
Oh, yeah.
And, I knew some people who would go to Occupy Oakland a lot, but also, were helping out with Occupy Cal. And, there was definitely some solidarity, but it could have been more. I knew a lot of people who were just down Occupy Oakland and were like, I'm not going to come up to campus. I mean, I'm going to go to my classes on campus, but you're not going to get involved with Occupy Cal.
That's
a lot of people who had been in protests at Cal formerly who were just like, whatever. And grad students who are obviously still here, and other people.
Mm-hmm.
There's just, people disillusioned by what had happened over the past 2.5 years.
Do you think that disillusionment is why people didn't get involved?
I think they were disillusioned because they think they have a certain understanding of the attitudes of students, and a very good understanding of how the systems of education and how the systems of charging students more money and managing them through administrators in the regions and the UCPD. They realize that students are corralled in a certain way to act and think in a certain teleology. As I'm getting a degree, I'm going to become an economic unit. It's this kind of view that's been forced upon students starting back before the 1960s with Clark Kerr. It's the same thing that the free speech movement was protesting. At its essential core, the reason you had white, black, Latino, male, female students coalescing in the free speech movement is that whether you were from the suburbs or whether you were African American and had your civil rights repressed, you were still a student who was having their rights repressed and who were having their freedom of speech repressed and not able to function in the way they believe they should be able to function as a student. And I think that's been true for all the protests that have happened here, since, and have happened especially relating to budget cuts in the last 3 years, including Occupy Cal. People are occupying and taking back space on campus because they believe that is their right as a student, because they have a different vision than Robert Birgeneau and Mark Yudof of what the students should be and what the students should be able to do, because we're paying for them to we're paying for their salaries, we're paying for their life and their ridiculous lifestyles. They should at least, listen to us and take into account, what is good for the student and what's going to, be beneficial for the student. Mario Savio used to say that, every student should have at least, a couple hours a day, planned and set out and required by the school to just do nothing and go sit in, the eucalyptus grove. That's almost... It's just stuff like that, is critical to being a student, having a critical reflection time, And that's just not thought of at all, because they think of, the student as an economic unit. And the student's not an economic unit.
You mentioned the violence, or the police, at least, earlier. And I wanted to know what your experience was with the violence that has been associated with Occupy.
The first day that I went to the Wheeler Hall occupation in 2009, the big one, there was barricades set up, and there were people that had formed lines of people acting as barricades, basically. And on the side I was on, there was actually no police barricades, but there was lines of police officers with batons. We were all just kind of standing there, and the first time I got pushed or punched by a cop, I was walking in this like little area just off the path, trying to go around to the other side of the building to see what was going on. And this cop like ran up in my way and started pushing me and saying, "You can't go around here." And I was just trying to walk down by Strawberry Creek to go around. I wasn't even heading towards the building. I was heading like kind of away from the building, in fact. And he was like, "No, you can't go down by the creek." Like, and then, you know, students are allowed to go down by the creek. Like, I go down there and had studied before. You know, I was like, "That's ridiculous. Like, this is stupid. Like, what are you doing? Like, this has nothing to do with those people in the building. Like, you're just literally beating up on me right now." And like, I just stood my ground, and people like all ran up and started filming it. And the cop like had continued to like keep pushing me, and that was like my first like physical encounter with like the law and like a cop. And I was just like, "This is ridiculous. Like, you can't restrict me from this space. This has nothing to do with like why you're here. You're just literally like enforcing these ridiculous rules." And for no reason, you know, this is just a complete like invasion of like my right to like be on this campus and be a student and to have free mobility. Like, this is stupid.
What did you say to the cop?
Gosh, I don't even remember. I was like, "This is my right to be here. Like, I pay to like go to this school. Like, I'm gonna stand my ground." You know.
And what did you feel?
I don't know. I was like pretty like pissed. I was like pretty pissed off at the time. So I was just like what the fuck are you doing? Like, no, like I'm gonna stand here. Like, it's like this is like ridiculous. And like when people like started running up and like watching me and like backing me up, I was like, you know, I felt more empowered to keep doing it and just keep standing my ground. And you know, eventually like the other cops like told me to back off. You know, and like I was just like, yeah, like what are you gonna do? Like, screw you. Like, of course I'm in the right. Like, what you're doing is totally wrong right now. Like, you should not even be touching me. Like, that's not what a police officer is supposed to even do in the first place. You could at least just ask me kindly.
And what do you think of the subsequent violence during the Occupy protests on campus?
Well, it was actually, I've been used to police violence. I mean, I've been arrested twice, and the second time I'd been arrested, I was actually standing on, like, whatever, 70-foot tall ledge and got grabbed from, like, from behind and pulled through a window. So, like, you know, I've seen, like, you know, I like, almost, like, hit my head on the window, and then, like, my friend tried to grab me by my foot, and I was just like, no, like, let go. Because I was not going to, like, get pulled apart by a cop and, like, one of my close friends. I was just like, no, don't do this, dude. And was, like, you know, dragged through Wheeler Hall, like, on my back, you know, like, so, like, I've been, like, you know, messed with, you know, so it's, like, not really that big a thing for me when I get, like, hit by a cop or poked with a baton, you know, like, if they hit the right spot, it's always going to hurt. But for me, it's not like a traumatic thing. It's not like a big thing. It's just like you're fucking dumb. Like, I have like this on video now. You know, like I protect myself and try and make sure, like, you know, I can keep account if I get injuries. You know, because the first time I got arrested, my handcuffs were so tight that I still have marks on my wrist. You know, like I remember like the pain and how ridiculous it is and how stupidly they can treat you, and like you have to hold people accountable for that. Like we tried to have a civil suit for what happened when I first got arrested, but there wasn't enough people to go forward, and it would have been, it's such a long process. That's like the crappy part. It's like if you are like abused by the police, like the process is so long and it's so biased that there's just almost no point in going through with it. That's sad.
Yeah, what was the first time that you got arrested?
We were occupying a freeway. We had walked onto a freeway during rush hour, and we basically all just got, you know, taken down because they just blocked off the whole freeway and surrounded us.
And why were you occupying the freeway?
It was part of a march. There's a rally for education in downtown Oakland at Franco Gabo Plaza, actually, and then there was just a march that had started, and the march, you know, the intention was to walk onto the freeway and then go to San Francisco and join another march that was going on in San Francisco. So we were going to walk over the bridge and everything. We were just going to walk all those miles over there, and that was the original intention. And obviously, you know, it was a bit grand of a vision, but a lot of the people who had, you know, initiated and were involved were part of this, you know, group of ideological people who were like, you know, like occupy everything, like demand everything, like, you know, ask for nothing, like, and so the thing was, like, you know, we want to be with those people. Like, this is the only way we can get there for free, technically, like, because of all the ridiculousness of the, you know, capitalist system and having to pay for the bar and having to whatever, you know, own a car or something to get to San Francisco, where we're just going to walk.
What group is this?
It was just a bunch of people who were at Franco Gabo Plaza for this protest. There was people who, there was just like a call for a march for whoever wanted to join to walk to San Francisco.
When was that?
That was March 4th. The first March 4th.
Of what year?
I guess that would have been 2010. March 4th, 2010, yeah. It was after the riot on Telegraph.
So what did you think of the way that the students in Occupy Cal were treated that day, that there was the attempt to set up the first encampment, and the videos went viral of the police beating the students?
Well, it was pretty sad to see what happened over setting up, like, a couple tents. I was right there on the front lines. I was trying to help people set up tents and trying to organize people into, formations, basically, to stop the cops from coming through. We were joining arms and stuff like that to, allow people time to set up tents. And, I was there on the lines with people, and, it was kind of nerve-wracking for a lot of people because it was their first time being at, a protest like that. And you could see it in people's eyes, but, people, galvanized support, and we were all we've done this before, we've had people do this before, I've been in your situation for the first time, this is, it's not that bad, don't worry, and, stand strong with people, have, a phone number written on your arm, so in case you go to jail and stuff, it's, not a big deal going to jail. I remember talking to a bunch of different freshmen being it's not a big deal to get arrested. If it's your first time, you should just not be that worried. You just need to, mentally prepare yourself, and understand in your mind if you're going to be able to be arrested or if you're going to opt out of a situation where you can get arrested. And we were talking to all these people so quickly and trying to be okay, there are older people who've done this before. It's fine. I've been arrested twice and I'm still in school. It's cool, And then when the police just started literally beating people to get through, people just started freaking out and people were crying, and eventually got to the point where the police literally had surrounded everyone and were just beating through the weakest parts of the line to get through, which were small girls, and they were just beating through the areas that had a lot of girls in them, and it was terrible. There was obvious pointed decisions by UCPD to go through certain parts of the line, and what do you do when you're watching an 8-year-old girl get beaten by a fat black dude with a baton? It's surreal, and then they're on the ground crying, and I picked up multiple people and just hustled them out of there,
That's crazy. Were you beaten?
I jumped on top of people so they wouldn't get beaten. So, I was just this is ridiculous. What the fuck? She's on the ground. Are you kidding me,
And were you arrested that day?
No, luckily I wasn't, actually. There was only a couple people that got arrested that first day. That was November 9th, 2011, I think.
Yeah.
And actually a bunch of people got charges a couple of weeks ago for that because they found through medical records and videos and stuff, and I was just glad I wasn't one of those people because a lot of those people were people that I had known and organized with before.
Yeah.
And then they just recently got their stay away order from campus lifted.
Yeah.
So the last day.
So could you explain a little bit what happened there?
Well, there was only a couple people arrested the day of, and one of them I think was the English professor who got yanked down by her hair, and some other people. But eventually, the tent was allowed to go up. So
yeah, because
people
everyone
ended up staying at night because the cops backed off because there were so many people that showed up. And it was a pretty horrendous situation.
So in the videos that you see of that day, you see the cops beating the front line of students. What happened after that? Did the students disperse, or did so many people show up that the cops had to back off?
Yeah, the thing is no one left and more people kept showing up. So initially the cops they basically cornered people on the building, and then they dismantled the tents, and then they started coming back out, and they started leaving, and everyone swarmed back into the area, and I think they set up another tent at that point, and then the cops were just in a line. There were two different lines. One was on the south side, and one was on the north side. And on the north side, the cops were in a line, and they were basically facing off with the lines of protesters, trying to push them back and trying to basically get people to leave because they called out a dispersal order, I think, at some point. And that's where they had yanked down the professor by her hair, and they were beating people on the front line, including the small Asian girl that Stephen Colbert referenced and stuff. And then on the other side, they were beating people as well, but they were mostly just backing off because the police station was right in the building that they were next to. So there was a south side entrance to the police station and a north side entrance, so the cops just split up and went into both entrances
And
from
what
their respective sides.
What building was it?
Sproul Hall.
So this is all happening on the front steps of Sproul.
Yeah, it was all in front. Yeah, because the police station has like underground entrances on like the north and south side. So, and then there's the steps in front, but those doors were locked the whole time because they were scared of the occupiers.
So there's been a criticism that Occupy has been derailed by the violence that surrounded it. Do you agree with these criticisms?
I don't think they've been derailed by the violence. Because the violence hasn't really affected that many people. And the most people the violence has really affected are the occupiers themselves. I mean, the problem is a lot of that goes unreported. I mean, especially when like the media, has such a fast cycle. Most of the reports that come out about Occupy encampments or Occupy clashes or violent protests are the reports that there was a certain number of police injured and unknown amount of like protesters injured. So I think like physically on like the bodies, there's been a lot of violence enacted actually upon the protesters and the occupiers that hasn't been accounted for on the on the side of, I would guess, say the establishment and the state and the police state. And that kind of violence against their bodies definitely is derailing. I mean, that scares people from going to events. That scares people from, going to marches, and you end up with situations where you have like almost like street battles like January 28th in Oakland, where people don't want to people don't want to be in that kind of situation. But if you have like a good peaceful occupation of an empty building like they tried in San Francisco recently, and you establish, an actual community center, like they were trying to do in Santa Cruz last fall, you could have people of all, participation levels come. People have different levels of participation in, protest activities. Some people are arrestable and will go to an action despite the fact they know they'll get arrested. Some people will go to things where they, will engage in, property violence, because, property violence is different than physical violence or economic violence, and especially when it's against, the state or against, corporate arms of the state.
How is it different?
Oh, I mean, the physical violence on the body and the violence upon other bodies is the kind of things that like Gandhi and Martin Luther King were really like talking about and thinking about. They weren't necessarily saying that like, oh no, property won't be destroyed. Property is immaterial to those people. In their spiritual understanding of like nonviolence and protest, and resistance. You can't just take violence. Like, there's going to be, necessary, violence that's going to be inflicted no matter what, because the state is always inflicting violence upon the body of, the oppressed people. You can't necessarily fight violence with non-violence. I mean, that's not going to work. These kind of people were open to, a diversity of tactics, and they didn't necessarily condemn the people who actually took part in, actual violent resistance, but even non-violent resistance is, technically violent. I mean, if you ask Robert Birgeneau, he'll tell you that students linking arms and standing in a line is technically violence on this campus. And maybe that's true, but there is a certain, violence that's enacted, by the non-violent peoples, And
what about the violence that some of the store owners experienced in Oakland? Like I heard they were smashing the storefronts and quote rioting down there, or unquote rioting.
Yeah. Well, the thing is a lot like some of that happens, I guess, indiscriminately. I mean, Oakland also is just very crime ridden, and it's not necessarily occupiers people who are acting in the actual intentions of Occupy who are doing all these things, especially when it comes to looting. But you have people who are, taking tactics, such as the Black Bloc, and taking them to their logical extension against, the capitalist state and the functioning of capitalism. It's kind of like if you think of it like a pyramid. There's money at the top that everyone's trying to get to, and it's distributed down through everything. But it's all mostly lost by the bottom, yet the bottom's still holding up the whole pyramid. And the 99% is the bottom, of the pyramid holding everyone up, but yet they get the least money. And so if those people at the bottom start, rupturing the system and start, removing themselves from it and start disrupting it, eventually the top will all crumble, And so that's kind of like their idea and their tactic. And, they don't try and go after local store owners. They try and be cognizant of if it's a locally owned place. There are local places that have survived, Occupy Oakland crashes. I mean, clashes in the street. But, there are other chains, corporate chains, Starbucks, Wells Fargo, banks, especially banks, are going to be the targets of, these people trying to, seek justice, basically.
Do you think the Occupy movement has been effective?
It's been effective in raising a dialogue. I think it's still yet to see if it's effective in the ways that I guess maybe I think it should be, or in the ways that its tactics suggest it should be. I think I see Occupy at the core as like it's anti-capitalist and it's anti-establishment, as in it's asking for a renegotiation of power relations. And it's inherently these things, and it'll never accomplish its goals until it maybe not realizes it about itself, because I'm sure it realizes it. Fox News has pointed it out at least, but without truly adopting those goals and that mindset and trying to create that culture, there's a cool culture about Occupy where people meet each other and like figure out that we have cross, community concerns, where you have, white anarchist punk kids going into predominantly African American neighborhoods and not only learning things from, maybe nurses who are teaching at an Occupy event, but they also can provide some knowledge to, African American, people as well about like, survival tactics or dumpster diving or, foraging for food or growing food or starting organic gardens, there's been these, like I know a guy named Poncho who lives in a house I think he used to live in a house with a couple people right on the border of a bunch of like gang territories, and he's just like this, he's from South America, but he was a nuclear physics grad student or something, or astrophysics grad student. He was involved in some nuclear project and like quit school here at Cal. And he was living in this house with these people where they were trying to mediate between these two gang territories, and they would have members of the different gangs come in at the house, and they would have events, and they would teach them, and like, that's the kind of stuff and the kind of culture that Occupy needs to keep generating. Pancho was like a big figure when he and his friends got arrested for meditating at one of the raids, and people need to like, take example from like different programs and different like ideas that people have generated in different parts of the country. Like in Orange County, they feed a lot of the homeless, and they've been trying to help the homeless people, like, avoid getting caught by police in Santa Ana because they're not allowed to sleep on certain public property during certain times because there's like, government officials or the public is like around a lot, and that's kind of like BS. But, Santa Ana has sit and lie laws, and, we need people to protest that kind of stuff. And Occupy Orange County's been doing that, and they've been roaming around Orange County. They did for like 300, it was like 3,000 something like hours or something. I don't know. Yeah. They had one of the longest going occupations of anyone because they were moving the location around Orange County, and they were going to different spots where there were a lot of homeless people and like trying to interact with the homeless. And I think Occupy Santa Ana is still doing that.
So there's been less news about Occupy lately. Why do you think that is?
A lot of the encampments got dismantled. There was a lot of focus and a lot of like, dialogue about, the physical being of Occupy, which is cool, which makes sense because, an occupation is a physical tactic. It's a tactic of space. It's a tactic of reclamation. But at the same time, that's why I don't know if it's the most appropriate frame for the whole, economic battle we're going through. So I think it was easier for, government and people to step in and be like, look at this totally violates the norm. It's getting to the point where it's dangerous. We can prove like these anomalous activities are, representative of the whole group, and thus they were able to shut down encampments. One guy got killed by Occupy Oakland because he was in the middle of a drug deal with someone. That's not Occupy Oakland's fault. That's just what happens in Oakland. That happens in West Oakland and downtown Oakland all the time. If you live in Oakland, that's not a big deal. There's plenty of black kids who get killed unceremoniously involved with drugs and gangs, and that's a reality in Oakland. That's not newsworthy, really, and that's sad to say, and that's unfortunate to understand. But like, residents of Oakland, like, they feel bad and like that sucks, but it's not uncommon. Just, Oakland's pretty bad. Like, their policing is terrible. That's where you can smoke weed wherever you want in Oakland. The minute protests head into Oakland, everyone just starts lighting up.
So there are plans for another nationwide strike day on May 1st. If Occupy heats up again on UC Berkeley campus or in Oakland, do you plan to get involved?
Oh, man, May Day has been growing around the country for the last couple of years. May Day has been getting bigger and bigger for the last 2 or 3 years, and I haven't really actually I've never been very involved, but I hear a lot from a lot of people who talk about the historical, the recent the historicity of the anarchists in the Bay Area, for instance, because there's been a strong presence of anarchists in the Bay Area for a long time, and anarchists are super into May Day, along with lots of other left people, and it's nice that Occupy is around to coincide with it and help propel it further into the national dialogue. I think Occupy is going to take a lot of heat for getting involved in May Day, and it's going to provide a lot of fodder for criticism, especially from the right, but at this point they kind of expect that anyway, I think. So, it makes sense because, the lefties are the people who are driving it for the most part, and, the country is not as conservative as everyone thinks it is, because everyone's being pretty trampled on, and more people are being alerted to the reality that, it's because of, wealth inequality, and it's because of economic inequality, it's because of economic biases and nepotism in government. And that's not cool.
So, what do you think the future of Occupy is?
I wish I could paint a really awesome, bright future. I had a lot of ideas when Occupy first started happening, a lot of cool programs and kind of things people could put together because they would have these new spaces to get together.
Like what?
Because Occupy was going to, open up all these spaces, and these encampments were going to create spaces for us to, organize in and think of things together. And there are spaces where people talked and talked forever. I'm kind of over that at this point because I've done that with people at protests for years. But that's always a great thing to have more people get involved with the conversation. And that's what Occupy needed to keep doing. And I don't know if it's going to keep doing that, but I hope it does. So I'd like to see people continue to get together in spaces and talk. It's good that Occupy Oakland keeps sprouting up in random parks and places, because that gives people a place to go and talk. And people need to do that. But people need to get real when talking in these places. They need to set up community programs. They need to set up community organizations to keep people in contact, to keep people together, to keep people trying to create alternate forms of power outside of the state. People don't like the state, can't vote your way out of it, unfortunately. You gotta just construct your own thing. One of the big ideas I had, I wanted to go back and try and talk to people about in Orange County. It never really happened, and I kind of got thrown off from doing it. It was a community garden movement would be huge right now for Occupy. Not only would gardens provide places for people to meet and talk about stuff, but they could grow food and provide for the communities. It's a double benefit. Occupy the garden. In the suburbs, it's a perfect tactic for the suburbs. People meet in each other's backyards to help garden each other's backyards and have potlucks and food, and they talk about stuff they've been hearing from around the country. People talk about what we can do to organize people in our community. And it would have been a cool thing to have a bunch of people because that's basically what the Tea Party is doing in a lot of suburban places, is they have these town hall meetings where you have just a bunch of super conservative, usually Christian people get together at the rec room in Mission Viejo, and we got this video sent to us by the Tea Party Express group. Let's launch this piece of propaganda for an hour, and then we'll talk about it, and then we'll share our feelings. That's what they're already doing in the suburbs. That's what Tupperware parties were doing. That's what all these sorts of little meetings are doing. That's why people have voting stations in their garages in the suburbs. That's just normal, and that kind of community building is what Occupy needs to do. And people do that in urban spaces, but people would have more of a challenge in urban spaces to come up with new ways to reappropriate space and utilize it for the public good. And people need to think about that, because that's what the tactic of occupation essentially is asking you to do, and wanting you to do is repurpose space and reclaim space. So if we're going to be an Occupy, let's actually occupy, because that's how we can change it from the ground up and subvert the current governmental system, or maybe get the governmental system to adapt to what we're doing because it's better. We would have organic grown food for all of our schools in the suburbs or something like that. Or, we'd all be able to plant food in the margins of the streets, because we'd actually be able to take care of the soil, and it wouldn't be nasty from just so many cars because we'd be able to ride bikes. Food, not lawns, that kind of thing.
Is there anything else that you want to share?
No, I mean, that was just like one big thing I had thought of and was like really into for a while, but it's challenging when you're only home for like a month. But, I always tell my mom, I'm just like, all the grass died back here, like, we had a trampoline that we took out like a couple months ago for her. Like, there's so much room, like, I don't know why you just don't have like a giant like plot of food here, Mom. If you have extra, just give it to people, or, like, totally do that. It's totally viable when you have nothing going on in your backyard, no kids, no animals. Actually, she thought about getting a chicken, which would have been awesome, which she should have done. I don't know. I had an ex-girlfriend that wanted to get a goat once, and I was just like, people in college can't take care of goats. That won't work. But it'd be awesome to have a goat and get goat milk. But, that's a challenge. But a chicken coop, it's not too hard to build. Not too hard to have a chicken. Like, I'm just surprised my mom even considered it.
Great, Alex. Well, thank you so much for spending the time to talk to me.
Yeah, dude, no problem.